Hi there, Scott Harris King, and it's day 11 of the social distancing here. We've been holed up, my wife and I, here for a while now, and as a result, I'm finally getting around to organizing all my comics. I've had quite a lot of comics over the last year or so that have just been piling up around my room. I've got them all cataloged now, and I'm about to start putting them away, so I thought I'd share some of them here with all of you. So the big thing that I collect these days is romance. So here's the romance that I've gotten just over the last year or so, and these are just the ones I collect. I also have a number of romance books that I've bought to trade or resell to other romance collectors. But we've got over here are books that are not from Charlton, Marvel, or DC. Most of them, as you can see, are from ACG, but I do have a few others. This pile here is all Charlton, and then the pile up at the top is all Marvel. Um, and then we have these three giant piles of DC. DC is kind of uh, my main focus, but yeah, and then there's this pile here. There's some of the bigger purchases over the last year. It's the Love 1971 special, the Super DC Giant 21 with a classic cover. Got this in a lot off of eBay. It's Young Romance number 10 by Simon and Kirby. This was actually the one that I paid the most for. It's a higher grade Girls Love Stories 52. I just love this classic greaser cover with the sort of watercolor cityscape in the background. I already had a copy, but when I saw this high grade copy come up, I had to get it. It was advertised as an 8, and I think 8 is reasonable. I might have it at 7.5, but I think you could reasonably call it an 8. So I'm very pleased with that. Here's Secret Hearts number 1, and I also have, you might have noticed earlier, Girls Romances number 1. These are two of DC's big 7 titles. So they're two sort of key books. They're not particularly noted for content or artists or anything, but for DC romance collectors, they're important. And then the CGC 5.0 Dark Mansion of Forbidden Love number 1. I'm not sure why they bothered CGCing this, but it allowed me to kind of get it a little bit cheaper. This is the last issue I needed for Dark Mansion of Forbidden Love, and I already have a complete run of Secret House of Sinister Love, including issues 5 of both of those titles. Not everyone that collects them realizes that when they switch to the horror titles, Dark Mansion and Sinister House, the 5th issue was already complete in the romance format. So issue 5 of both runs, even though they've changed the title, are still Gothic romance. So if you don't have those, you should pick up those issue 5s because it's the same content. It's just packaged as more mainstream horror. So yeah, also you may have noticed on top of this pile, it just happens to have Girls Romances 105. This is a key issue because it includes one of the stories that Roy Lichtenstein used for one of his famous rip-off paintings, the pop art paintings. I think this one is the girl in the car, but I forget exactly. It's not it's always interesting to note which issues he worked on, but I'm trying to complete all of these runs, so I was lucky to get this cheap. And it's a solid, lower mid grade. It's probably a 4.5 at best, but it looks nice, and the price is right. So here's a closer look at the Charltons. I'm about to file these away. This is from the late 50s. Some of the earlier Charlton romance books from the 50s are extremely hard to find in decent condition. There are just not many copies around at all. And this is a nice mid-grade copy. It's probably a 5.5. It looks better. It has some, some technical defects, but I'd comfortable at a 5 at least. And it's just an absolutely beautiful cover by Vince Colletta, who, a lot of comic fans, have a grudge against him because his inking destroyed a lot of cool superhero pencils by the likes of Jack Kirby. But long before that, back in the 50s, he was one of the top romance artists. You can clearly see, if you're a romance comic fan, just how much he was influenced by Matt Baker. The guy in this cover is just 100% Matt Baker. They work together. There are some people that question whether on some of these covers that look like Baker art, whether Baker actually was working with Colletta on it, maybe just doing layouts and stuff like that. I don't know. I would hesitate to label this a Baker cover, but it doesn't really matter. It's just so, so nice. Here's another cover. So the way I organize my Charltons is different than I do for any of the other titles. Charlton has the most romance comics of any publisher, and so there's over 1,200 romance comics from Charlton. So it's very difficult to collect them all, and so what I have is my Charlton collection is organized into 3 sections. There's the covers that I'm in the issues, because some of the interior content in Charlton is really crazy. So there's the issues that I am specifically looking for. Then there's my sort of second class Charltons, which are ones where I don't think they're quite as interesting, but they're still cool enough where I want to keep them for sure. And then there's all the rest of the Charlton Romance books. And so a lot of times I'll pick them up if I see them really cheap, or if I get like a big lot. So I do have quite a number of Charlton Romance that I'm not necessarily that interested in. But unlike, normally I'm a run collector. I want to get all the issues of a run. I'm not really doing that with Charlton. I have to pick and choose. I'm just trying to focus on the Charlton books that are of particular interest. In this case, this is one of the, I think, only 5 covers that the artist Demetrio did. And they're all fantastic. This is Time for Love number 40. And then this is my personal favorite of his covers, which is Secret Romance number 30. It took me quite a while to even find an affordable copy. They do pop up from time to time on eBay, and it's just a matter of whether the seller knows anything about the romance. And if they do, they're very expensive. And if they don't, you can get a deal. In this case, it's a nicer copy. It's like probably they have it listed as fine, very fine, and I think that's about right. So this is my favorite of his covers. There's this classic mod Love Diary cover. They actually reused the female figure from this on a totally different issue, reprinting it. But they changed the background, so there's like a bunch of surfer dudes, but the original is definitely the better of them. Here's a negligee cover from Art Capello. His art, I think, is really underrated. It's also very uneven because he was putting out quite a lot of it. But he did, I really have started to appreciate some of his cover work later on, late 60s and into the 70s in particular. He was doing some really cool ones. He has a style that's reminiscent for me of my favorite artist, which is the Archie artist Harry Lucy, who has a very thick line for like the outline of the characters, and that's something that Art Capello did. He has a very bold graphic style. Here's Haunted Love number 1. This was reprinted by Modern Comics, which is hilarious because the Modern Comics reprint from a decade later still has the thing at the top that says all new first edition, even though it's a reprint. So I had the reprint already, but I had a chance at a nice copy, cheap, of Haunted Love. One of the best series. If you're going to start anywhere with Charlton, I think Haunted Love is a great place to start because I think it only ran for 13 issues, and there's all these like great gothic horror covers, just some fantastic artwork. There's several that I like more than this, but I dig this one quite a bit. And then finally, there's what for me is the number one Bronze Age Charlton book, and actually probably the top two Bronze Age romance books, period, which is Just Married 104. This is, as far as I know, the only romance comic mainstream. I'm not talking about like underground, but the only like mainstream, widely distributed romance comic that ever featured a kiss between a white and a black character. This is from 1975. There are a few romance comics previously that had, particularly in the late 60s at DC, that hinted at interracial romances. And there are some covers that have other interracial romances, like, it'd be like a man with an Asian woman, that sort of thing. But this is the only one where they have a black character and a white character kissing. And, just not that long before this, there were other books that Charlton put out that featured African American characters that were they couldn't get the distribution, and people just returned them unopened because of the racism. So this was a really bold. Plus, it's just a fantastic cover. It's by Joe Staton, so it's just great. I have 3 copies of this. It's not an easy book to find. I think it's in my experience, it's much more difficult to find any copies of Just Married 104 compared to any of the issues around it. Um, and all Charltons are hard to find in high grade. I do know someone that has a couple really high grade copies of this, but anytime I see this online or in person, I buy it. That's my number one rule with romance. Just Married 104, always buy it. And then these are some of the other Charlton Romance that are of less interest to me, but they're all cool. This is a higher grade early issue of Brides in Love, which is difficult to find. Anything, if it's a 10-cent Charlton and it's above like a 6, you should probably buy it if you can, because the chances of seeing a copy that nice again are slim to none. So here's a small pile of books from publishers that are not Charlton, Marvel, or DC. For the most part, I don't really collect the other publishers. Most of the publishers that did romance comics, and there's dozens of them, were doing stuff, in the late 40s and throughout the 50s, and those books are of less interest to me. So for the most part, if I get those, I'll, like Atlas books or, Ajax or something, I'll trade those or sell them to other romance collectors. Because there's a nice community of romance collectors. They're hard enough to find, so if you do find something and it's not in your personal wheelhouse, there's always another romance collector who has been looking for the book and hasn't been able to find it. So that's nice. But one big exception for me is I do love the ACG books. They seem to be significantly more difficult to find in the wild than DC books, or Charlton books in particular, also the Marvel books. The late Atlas books that were still coming out during the Marvel age, like in 61, 62, those books like Love Romances that got canceled to make way for the Marvel superhero books. Some of those are very difficult to find, but for the most part, the later Marvel stuff from the Bronze Age is not too hard to find. ACG, though, is a little more difficult, which is too bad in some ways, because their stories are really interesting, and for the most part better than, to my eye, better than the stuff that Marvel and DC are putting out. Much less formulaic, a lot more plot driven, like weird things happening. So it's just much more of an entertaining read than the DC formula. I happened to get a big lot of romance books earlier, later last year, so within the last year, that had quite a bit of few issues of My Romantic Adventures, which is they had 2 titles, this one and we'll see later, The Confessions of the Lovelorn. And I'm a big fan of My Romantic Adventures in particular, so I was happy to get these. Got a number of issues, mostly from the early 60s. but also a few from the late 50s. These are all still 10-cent books that we're going through here. So, yeah, just the cool stuff like this, set in Paris, and there's, the old trope of the artist. There's so many romance books there where there's an artist that falls in love with a model or vice versa. So yeah, My Romantic Adventures. I was really happy to get these. They're all lower grade, but they're solid. Some of the books I got in this lot, particularly some of the DC books, were really, really rough. It was like a huge lot um, of romance books, and some of the DC ones were pretty bad. But these ones are actually pretty solid, and I was really happy to pick them up because they're not that easy to find. Here's the Confessions of the Lovelorn with a painted cover and a really like wackadoodle story inside. Um, Here's one of the rare non-Marvel DC ACG Charlton books that I wanted to keep for myself because it's published by Lev Gleason, who did Boy Comics, and I have a complete run of Boy Comics, so I view this Boy Meets Girl as sort of like their romance spin-off, which is not, but anyway, yeah. So there's a couple more that I picked up a little bit earlier. So this is an Australian edition that I accidentally ordered off of eBay. There was a different Australian book I was trying to buy from the same dealer because the other one, the one I really wanted, had a reprint of the famous story I joined a teenage sex cult that I happened to notice was reprinted in it, but I just somehow misclicked and I bought the wrong one. It's still really cool to have these old Australian romance books, but that was a disappointment. It's my own fault. And here's just a quick look at a little pile of Marvels that I got over the last year. Marvel in the late Silver Age launched 2 romance titles. They lasted into the mid 70s. It's Our Love Story and My Love. There are a couple keys from these runs. See, here's issue 2, issue 3, issue 5 is really the key issue from Our Love Story. It has a fantastic story by the great Jim Steranko in it with just amazing art. Actually already had a copy of this, but I was able to upgrade, so I did that. Here's some Patsy Walker books. They're not really romance; they're more soap opera at this point. The book transitioned from teen humor, like Archie-style teen humor, into pure soap opera. And this is a storyline that I'm trying to collect the entire story arc because it involves the Vietnam War, and it actually goes back and forth between Patsy Walker and Patsy and Hetty because she had 2 titles at the time, and so you have to get several issues of both titles. It's very tight continuity, actually tighter than what was going on in the rest of the Marvel universe at this time, which is very early on in Marvel. So I have a few of these, and yeah, so some more Patsy Walker books. Here's another from this same storyline. You can see in the background, that's Patsy's boyfriend Buzz, who was sent to Vietnam and is wounded in combat. He comes back in a wheelchair. It's just really, really groundbreaking. This is 1965, so it's just super groundbreaking. Just imagine an Archie storyline where Reggie gets, sent to Vietnam and, comes back in a wheelchair. That's basically what was happening here, because Buzz had been the main love interest for Patsy Walker since the strip debuted in 1945 for 20 years and was a teen adventure. And then all of a sudden they just like, the dude gets sent to Vietnam and gets shot. So really groundbreaking. I haven't put all that run together yet, but I've got the last issue of that storyline in the mail right now. So I'm really looking forward to finishing that one. And finally, we just have these piles and piles of DC romance. I'm just going to go through some of these real quick. I've organized them in alphabetical order, and just to give a quick look at some of these. Falling in Love. see, I got quite a few of these. Here's a cool cover, sort of like a mod jailbird cover. Um, this is one that I think could get some interest. The Women Behind Bars covers frequently do. And, now, the one issue of Falling in Love that, of course, is key from this era that I don't have yet is issue 99 with the Palisades Park cover. I just haven't been able to find it. I've found in the wild or on eBay just about everything else that's important from this era. But I just have not been able to find a Falling in Love 99 that's not super expensive. Here's some earlier girls' love stories. I got a bit of a soft spot for the early issues that have this bullet logo. Here's another one. These are from the mid 50s. You can see this is still pre-code. So I really dig this era. Here's a really cool girls' love story just after its post-code. I love the pink logo, but also just the design with the the pink masthead with the black logo. Really, really like this cover a lot. Here's another great cover. A very dramatic rain cover. So, yeah, a lot of these covers are John Romita. He worked at Romance, DC on Romance Comics for like 8 years, and he just put out some just absolutely great stuff. And sort of the other artists like J. Scott Pike. Just some really terrific artwork in these. Very underrated. I really dig this era of the logo. That little, like, I don't know, almost looks like an artist's palette, like a painter's palette, where they have all the little paint things. I don't know. It's just very short-lived. Here's another pre-code. It's got that little circle up at the top. Girls' Romances. Post-code, but they still have the little circle at the top, so it's right after the code. Yeah, it's just this stuff is just great. This is where it's at. Yeah, it's just cool. I love this cover. So dramatic. The black and the flames and the lighting. And I love it. She's lighting his picture on fire, and he's standing in the background with a look on his face that's like, what the F? Yeah, that's what you get, buddy. That's what you get. Oh yeah, terrific cover. My copy's trashed, but so dramatic. Just some great covers. Getting on the airplane. Yeah, so cool. Here's a nice Stop the Wedding cover. I have a couple copies of this. They're both like complete rags. Just fantastic artwork. So underrated. Here's a great cover by Gene Colan, another terrific artist. My copy is really badly discolored, but the real, nice copies of this with the pure pink are just fantastic. So some more. Some of these were part of this low grade lot that I got that are really beat up. Here's a cool one, another cover that is starting to break out a little because of the cool mod design elements. It's funky looking. And then here's a two-part story that's really great. It's kind of a classic involving soldiers in Vietnam. And so I have a little bit of a sub-collection where I collect covers and stories that deal with Vietnam in romance, particularly. My father is a Vietnam veteran. He did 2 tours. And so, these hold a particular interest for me. This is the great story from 1967, and written by Barbara Freelander. So just a lot of really cool books here. Here's Heartthrobs number 2 is interesting. I have this in my DC pile. This issue is not actually from DC. Some of these titles are ones that DC bought out from other publishers. Some from Quality, and some from Prize or Crestwood. So Heartthrobs is one of the titles that they took over, and this is actually number 47 is the first DC issue of Heartthrobs. So here's a bunch of cool Heartthrobs covers. Really dig this one a lot. Here's another cool one. This is like a Beatles inspired cover. Issue 100. Here's another Barbara Freelander one. This is during the brief period when DC went to these ongoing soap opera stories. The Three Girls, Their Lives, Their Loves was the one that ran in Heartthrobs for over 20 issues, and it's just an ongoing soap opera written by Barbara Freelander. I'm a big fan of these. I grew up watching a lot of soap operas with my grandmother, so these are kind of a favorite of mine. Here's a classic domestic abuse cover. I know that sounds kind of weird to say. It's a Neil Adams cover. It's he did do a few other romance covers, but this is one of very few that he did. And it's got this very dramatic monotone color scheme as well as being a Neil Adams art. So this is kind of a desirable issue. And here's another one. This has a cool cover where she's carrying the Jimi Hendrix Experience album. So that's of particular interest. I happen to have a pretty nice copy of that one. I got a good deal on a couple of these in this era where I have some really nice copies. Then right at the end of the run, the title switched from Heartthrobs to Love Stories. There are only a few issues done with the Love Stories title. They're kind of harder to find than some of the other ones. In general, the last few issues of a lot of these DC runs are pretty hard to find, with the exception, for some reason, of Young Love. Those seem to be the last couple, 2 or 3 issues seem to be relatively easy compared to the ones just before them. Here we have Secret Hearts. You can see this is Secret Hearts number 82. Just missed the boat here. The big ticket issue is 83. That has the infamous Roy Lichtenstein Drowning Girl. It's a full page splash in issue 83 that he completely ripped off. So that issue is sort of broken out. People are aware of it now, and it goes for quite a bit of money. So here's issue 89. Just some great covers. I love the Romantic Moon covers. Yeah, so good. Here's a new logo for Secret Hearts, much more modern. Reach for Happiness, that's the ongoing soap opera in Secret Hearts, again written by Barbara Freelander. Can a man ever really forget and forgive a girl's bad reputation? A searing episode of Reach for Happiness. This is a stirring episode. Yeah, these are great. Okay. And finally, we got Young Love and Young Romance. This top one here is not from DC. I don't even know what number it is. The numbering on Young Love is really confusing. The original series by Simon and Kirby lasted like 73 issues or something. Then it changed to a different publisher. They canceled it. But then they took one of their existing titles, I think it was called All for Love or something like that, and retitled it Young Love partway through the run. So the first issue of this second volume of Young Love was like number 17, but they didn't put the numbers on them. It was just the dates, the numbers somewhere in the inside. And that continued until it switched over to DC, and then DC picked up the numbering starting with issue 39. So this is one of these volume 2, somewhere between 17 and 38. But it's weird because like issue 17 is sort of number 1, but it's also sort of number 74 or something. So anyway, blah blah blah. Young Love is probably my favorite of the DC titles. It's also like the one I probably have the most of. Young Love and Romance both. Those are the ones I guess I'm focusing on first to try and complete the DC portion of those runs. Here's some of these earlier Young Loves. Is clearly someone wrote a yeah. Really dig this logo. It didn't last very long. This one is, this blockier logo I'm not as big a fan of. And then here's a funky logo. This is issue 100. They only had this logo for a few issues. Then another logo. This is more like their classic logo. Here's one of the giant size 100 pagers. I got a couple of these that are in quite nice condition. And then this is one of the later issues that's a little bit harder to find. I think this is a J. Scott Pike cover. I'm not sure. One of these Bad Boy Motorcycle Gang covers. And then here's a cool one. I've got a couple copies of this. This is the next to last issue, and it's got a cover by Walt Simonson. I think this is the only romance cover they did. The other copy I have is autographed by Walt Simonson. And then here's Young Romance. The first DC issue is 125. And that one, I think the numbering continued straight through from the original Simon and Kirby series. There's a bunch of issues from when it switched publishers. I think it went from Crestwood to Prize, and they stopped putting the numbers on them, but they started just doing like Volume X, like Volume 1, number 8 or something. But eventually when they switched back to DC, they picked up where the numbering should have been. I think that's right. And 125 was the first issue. It ran up to issue 208. So the DC run really wasn't that long. It was only 80 some issues. I have most of them at this point, but I'm still missing a few stragglers. And a lot of great John Romita covers in here. This is one of my favorites. It's got this great gray wash sky effects, probably by Jack Adler, the colorist at DC at the time. I've got a couple copies of this. I just love this cover. This is also part of the Bonnie Taylor Airline Stewardess series. This was DC's sort of first attempt at doing these ongoing soap opera, like serialized things. When they first took over these books from Prize, they tried this in a couple titles. It didn't last that long, and then several years later they tried it again with Barbara Friedlander. So here's some more, some great dramatic, the drama. I love the sky there. I don't know if that's purple or blue because I'm colorblind, but I love it. Yeah, just so good. So good. There's no issue 150 in this pile. There was, but I sold it. I've been lucky enough to have 3 copies of 150, which is a classic J. Scott Pike cover of the girl crying from behind her sunglasses, and in the reflection is her boyfriend kissing someone else. Sort of the epitome of DC romance. So that's become a highly sought after collectible cover. You can see these are not in great shape. I actually got 2 different eBay lots of a bunch of Young Romance, and both of them were absolutely hammered. But they're complete and readable, and they will make good reading material until I get better copies. Here's a more modern logo that I dig. Several more of these Young Romance. This is a really cool cover. Really like the color scheme. I like the new logo. It's just really really a good one. Dig that cover a lot. 52, the DC's 52 big pages era. I love these. Young Romance had some cool ones. Here's a highly sought after cover. I think this is Pike again. Very sensual. Yeah, just some really cool books. This is a key issue here. I've got a couple of copies that are in pretty nice shape. It's a story, an interracial romance story. I think it's might have been written by Robert Conagher. He came back to do romance at this time after a long time away, and he was very much into doing these sort of social issues of the day. It's a very, very rare cover hinting at an interracial romance, and specifically with a romance between black and white characters. DC shied away from showing like explicitly like a kiss or something like that the Just Married Charlton cover from several years later. This is a much earlier story, but you know they didn't want to show that on the cover, so they have this more dramatic sort of hospital scene. But this is about an interracial romance that is doomed by racism on both sides from the families that don't want it to happen, and then he tragically dies. Spoilers. Again, the DC 100 pages. Some of these are in nice shape. These can be kind of hard to find, period, but particularly in decent shape. Issue 200, 202, and then also difficult to find the last issue of Young Romance. So you can see I only paid $6 for mine, which is a pretty good deal, even though it's pretty trashed. It's only maybe a 4.0. But I've seen these in this condition go for as much as 20 online because it's just not an easy issue to find. Yeah, there's sort of an overview of the romance purchases